Now. Yes. Can everybody in the back who's not deaf hear me? All right. My name is Aaron Allston, and it has been 52 hours since I've had any caffeine, so you're all in trouble.
Get that man some caffeine stat.
And today we're going to talk about an alternate means to writing novels. But before we get underway, I want to let you know, what was it I was going to let you know? I can't remember what I was going to let you know. Oh yes, I'm going to make a very self-serving statement announcement first off. I am at the end of a process of writing a book about plotting. It'll be available as an ebook off my website in about 3 weeks. So if you're interested in my book, Plotting, a Novelist's Workout Guide, catch up with me outside after this panel is done and ask me for a card. I've got a card with information on it. Anyway, that's my one commercial of the day. This seminar is called Laying Down Tracks, and it's called that as a reference to the process by which music is mixed in studio recording sessions. And I'll get to that in a second. I want to let you know, first off, it's fine to ask questions at any point in the seminar. When Nancy's sitting here, she'll be able to let me know that you're asking questions. I can't see worth a damn. So no point in asking anything right now. Please keep them on topic as to what's being discussed at that moment. If you have any more general questions, try to hold them to the end of the seminar, and if we have time, we'll get to those as well. Let's see here. What do I have in my notes?
I do not know.
I don't know either. All right. First off, I want to talk about flow state. Some of you will be familiar with the term flow state. It's sort of an altered, and enhanced state of mind you get into when you're involved in a creative process and sometimes an athletic process. Musicians know it as being in the groove, in the zone, finding your rhythm. And it occurs to writers as well. And what this seminar is about in part is a method by which you can find yourself in flow state more often. I referred to laying down tracks in studio music. You probably know that when you're on stage playing music, because you're all rock musicians clearly, that you get up there, you play, it's recorded. In the studio, what generally happens is that one or two musicians will perform at a time and lay down tracks. They're recorded separately from one another. So you may have the vocalist all by him or herself, or you may have the guitarist. You may have the two of them together, and then they do their tracks, and then the bassist will come in, or the drummer, or any number of other performers who are working on that specific recording and lay down their tracks. And they have somebody on the mixing board who will carefully mix them. The producer mixes them so that they blend together into the best possible piece of music, which is why studio music sounds somewhat different from live. It's less raw, sometimes less emotional, but a lot more polished. And this technique of writing novels sort of simulates the process of laying down tracks in studio music. What most people do when they are writing novels is write pretty much from start to finish. They'll write a scene, they'll write a chapter, they'll go on to the next one, they'll go on to the next. They may bounce around a little bit as they realize the need to insert a scene earlier or later. They may decide to skip over a bunch of chapters that aren't inspiring them yet and write the ones that follow and then come back to those. But it's all pretty linear. It's mostly a linear process. And when you're doing that, you're pretty much writing everything. You're writing the action and the dialogue and the exposition and the internal monologue and so forth and so on all at once. The description. Those are the basic 5 elements of your basic 5 components of writing. And so you're doing them all at once. And we're going to talk about a way not to do that. I spoke of flow state before. I assume that most of you are writers at some level, aspiring writers, people who've been writing for a few years or a few months, and have gotten to know some of your own habits as writers. Am I correct? Yeah. Okay. Have any of you ever found yourself in flow state? Yes. Yeah. I'm hearing some yeses, and that's good. What you need to be paying attention to at this point is what kind of material you are writing that most often puts you in a flow state situation. For a lot of you, it will be action, the events, the narration of the events as they're occurring. Not necessarily violence, but active, activity on the part of your characters. For others, it will be dialogue. Some of you get really caught up in the dialogue, the back and forth, the banter between characters, and that will put you in the zone, and you'll be writing. With others, it'll be description. With each of you, it could be something different. It could be 2 or 3 of these elements all at the same time. But for each of you, it will be different. And you will know you have been in flow state writing. For those of you who haven't realized you've done it, you'll come out of a 4 or 6 hour writing jag. You may be sweating profusely. You may not remember every minute of the hours you just spent, and you will have generated an incredible amount of text. Does that sound familiar to any of you?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, okay. So what this technique that I'm going to get into does is improve the odds that you can do flow state work. So over a span of writing, over the months and years as you write, you will come to have a sense of what puts you in flow state. Like I said, could be action, could be dialogue, could be any number of these things. Keep that in mind. When you're writing your next novel, think about doing it this way. You've got your outline, or at least your mental preparation, the direction you want to head when you are writing your story. So you sit down, and instead of writing it out linearly, as I described that most people do, I want you to take just the one element that tends to put you in flow state most often and write just that. Let's say it's action. So you write the action scenes, one after the other, the action of your scenes, one after the other. Don't worry about dialogue. You can put it in really abbreviated form. Instead of having an actual dialogue exchange, you say, Joe tells Jill he's going to the store. Just an abbreviation. And you get back to the action. Action, action, action. And you write the whole novel straight through, concentrating on that one element, that one ingredient, all the way to the end. Ignore everything else. Ignore dialogue if that's not what you're concentrating on. Ignore exposition if that's not what you're concentrating on. Just write the one thing that gets you through the text the fastest, that puts you in flow state most often. What you will find, how many of you participate in NaNoWriMo? A few of you. Well, in NaNoWriMo, generally you're obliged to generate at least 1,667 words a day to get your 50,000 words in a month mark, correct?
Yeah.
When you're doing this approach, you probably want to concentrate more on 2,000 to 2,500 words a day, which is a little higher than your average for NaNoWriMo. For those of you who are just writing on your own schedule, just write the maximum amount that is appropriate for the time you have available to you. You'll find that it's probably a couple or 3,000 words a day. And you generate at a blitzkrieg pace and go through all the way to the end. And this is what we call your first creative pass. Now, the fact we're calling it the first creative pass should suggest to you that there are going to be other creative passes and that there are other passes that are not creative. And that's what this structure is all about. But you will find, let's say if you're doing NaNoWriMo and looking for a 50,000 word book, if you are writing at 2,500 words a day, in only 10 days, you will complete half of your book, and you will probably complete all the one element you're working on. Let's say it's all the action. By the end of 10 days, you have reached the end of your story in this one very limited way. Now think about that. For those of you who have struggled with novels, struggled with writer's block, struggled with finishing a story, think about what that's going to do to you on an emotional level, realizing you have completed your story. Of course, there is another thing to realize, which is if you just concentrate on one element, going all the way from beginning to end, the story you've completed is probably crap. And this is not a tragedy because you're going to fix it. And you're going to fix it by going through and doing your other creative passes. I talked about five basic elements that go into fictional storytelling. We have action, narrative. We have dialogue. We have exposition, which is kind of your backstory asides. We have internal monologue, which is your characters thinking to themselves. And we have description. 5 basic elements. You'll notice that I don't mention characterization, and that is because characterization, while it is an essential ingredient of all fiction storytelling, actually is made up of all those other 5 elements. It does not exist as a thing unto itself. If you think to yourself, well, we'll write some characterization that is none of the above, you will draw a blank because it is going to be one or more of the above. So don't worry about characterization, it will come with the other stuff you're doing. But, so you've done one pass, you've done one, maybe two of those elements, and you go back and you start doing other creative passes. You start over from the very beginning, and you layer in the next element, or the next two elements, if you're comfortable writing more than one at a time. You are laying down tracks at this point. Your first track was what you did first, your next track is what you do next. And in the course of your subsequent tracks that you're laying down, you will not just be writing the new material, not just adding the dialogue, for example, but a part of you will be adjusting the material that's there before. So as you go through, you're going to be doing a little bit of revision all the way through each time, each one of these passes. And I'll give you a second to think about questions on this issue while I try to catch up with my notes, because I have spoken out way ahead of them. I do that. I'm terribly disorganized. Let's see here. Got that. I'm amazed I haven't forgotten anything yet. Let's.
And we have one question, Aaron, when you're ready.
Sorry.
The 5 elements: action, dialogue, exposition, internal monologue, and description.
Yes.
Thank you.
Boy, that was easy.
I could answer that.
I've just now gotten to the point where I said it was crap, so, you know. You know where I am.
No.
Okay. So you've gone through once, twice, 3 times, maybe as many as 5 times, and you've generated a novel to the end. You actually generated a complete novel because you have all 5 elements done. You have your 50,000 words or 100,000 words or however many it is that you're aiming for. You are complete. The good news is you are complete. You can look at that and say, I have finished this novel. Or if it's your first one, I have finished a novel. Because that's a big, big motivational thing. Those of you who have finished a novel know this. It's big. The bad news is it's still crap. So we're going to talk about smoothing out the elements that are crap. And I will tell you that it is not as bad as it was before, because you have made a more complete, a more fully rounded manuscript at this point. And each stage we're going to do makes it better and better and better and better. So we have done what we call the creative passes here. And now we get to the analytical passes. When you're doing analytical passes, you will probably not be entering flow state, because you're going to be analytical. Flow state and analytical are other 2 sides of the same coin. You can't be on one side at both sides at the same time. And before I get to that, I do want to go back just a step. I was talking about working day after day, maybe 10 days to complete a track. One thing you can do that will also help you stay on track is at the start of each day, the start of each new day's writing, you go back through and you do a very, very, very light edit on the previous day's work. Just the previous days. This does a couple of things for you. The first thing is it gets you back into the mindset of what you were writing. If you start out the morning groggy the way I do, then this is very helpful. Also, if you are capable of disciplining yourself to the point that it is a very, very light edit you're doing, just what we call a gloss, then you're not going to get so deeply involved in the editing process that you stop writing. And this is a hazard that some people face. They'll get to a point where they want to revise what they've just written, and it gets in their way. They enter an editing mode and stop being able to create. So we don't want to do that. Start of each day, you do a little bit of editing on your previous 1 day's work, and then start proceeding writing. So, at the end of your basic 5 tracks, your basic 5 elements, we do analytical passes. And there you can get into a fully fully analytical mode. And what you're going to do is you're going to concentrate on 1, 2, maybe 3 elements at a time, and do pass after pass after pass, rereading and revising your story so far. How many kind of depends on who you are and what you're comfortable with. Here's where I can't predict. Some of you will be comfortable with doing only one, and some will be able to do 2 or 3 because that's the way your mind works. You're able to multitask. You know yourself. You can tell. You can decide for yourself how many to do. What I'm going to talk about here is each of the individual passes that you can either group together or do separately. All of them are pretty much necessary. So, a little ahead of myself now. Step 1.
And we have another question,
Oh, go
Aaron.
ahead. Go ahead with the question.
What is a personal suggestion for avoiding that hazard of wanting to just revise as you write and then derailing yourself? Because I do that all the time, and I usually derail myself to the point where I don't even want to write anymore because that lose that creative juice.
Well, that is like I said, that's a definite hazard. Sometimes it's more for some people than other people. It might take something as simple as putting a note on your computer or making your computer desktop say, "Don't edit, damn it." and I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
The habit of editing as you go can become deeply ingrained, and you've got to get out of that habit. So whatever it takes to remind you, Post-it notes all over the computer, maybe stapled to your face. You say, "What's that pain?" You go look at the mirror. Oh yeah, don't edit. You could have your significant other wander through it at bi-hourly intervals and say, "Are you editing?" Yes. Once again, you have to find the method that works best for you, but there are lots of things you can do. The fact that you do have to end the day and sleep and come back to it later does give you the opportunity to think about what you're doing. You might put at the top of your manuscript just words at the top of your manuscript, "Don't edit," so that when it comes up at the start of every day, you have at least that reminder. And over time, I know it may sound dubious to you, but over time it will get easier. You will get out of the habit of doing all that editing while you're writing, and then you can do the editing while you're supposed to be editing. Anyway, if anybody else has suggestions for him, grab him outside the panel and tell him what you do to keep from editing.
Please.
Another thing you can do that is helpful is when you're in your creative passes on a novel, work big blocks of hours, at least 4 hours at a time. When you're in editing mode, you can break it up and have hourly breaks. But if you're in a time crunch habit, especially in the creative passes, you'll feel a different rhythm when you're supposed to be writing as opposed to when you're supposed to be editing, and that might help. So anyway, various passes of your analytical passes, various elements of your analytical passes. First one is test your logic. This is a test your logic test. What's your logic? Well, there are all sorts of kinds of logic in a story. For example, there's the logic behind character motivation. Look at your character's motivation and say, does this make sense for the character? Does this make sense for a human being? Oftentimes, you may find yourself forcing your character to do something for the convenience of the plot that does not make sense for the character or really any character. So in one of these first analytical passes, you test your character motivation and say, does this make sense? If it doesn't, you sigh and you grit your teeth and you put on your cleats and you go in and you revise the manuscript so that your character motivations make sense. That is an entire element unto itself. Plans and strategy. Character plans and strategy. Characters often strategize if they're pursuing a goal. It may be as innocent and helpful a strategy as win the heart of a loved one, but there is strategy involved. I'll stalk her until she loves me. Well, okay, not a good strategy necessarily, but does the strategy make sense for the character? Does the strategy make sense for this universe, for your setting? Because different cultures will have different reactions. If you stalk her because you love her, in some cultures, the brother-in-law or the brother will come and stab you to death and the novel's over. That's not good. So you test your plans and your strategy in one of your passes. Relationship logic. Do characters make sense in their relationships? I'm not just talking about romantic relationships. Familial relationships. if you have a parent who is psychologically abusive, yes, it makes, and you may still have children who love that parent, but the relationship is not uncomplicated, and the kid is going to be a twitchy mess, even if he loves his parent, because of that abusiveness. Does the relationship make sense? I can't count the number of times people I've met in real life who say, well, he and she ought to be together because they look so good together. I have wanted to strangle people so often because you know in real life that just because they look good together doesn't mean they're going to be a good couple. In fact, just as often they're going to be a rotten couple. If they both look great, like two Hollywood celebrities, they're probably too busy preening to be emotionally invested in one another to the degree they should be, so they're going to be a rotten couple. Test the logic of your relationships. Examine the two characterizations and see not just whether they could be together, but what it would take for them to be together. What kind of work, what kind of accommodations and adjustments they have to make to one another's lives and personalities to stay together as a couple. Or if we're not talking romantic, once again, if we're talking familial, how they work together to get along, or what happens if they don't. Test the logic of your relationships. This is an important pass for one of your runs through your novel. Let's see here. Science, magic, and other procedures. You are all science fiction fans, or you wouldn't be here. Well, if you introduce a scientific change, a cultural change, an anthropological change, a medical change, an environmental change into a setting, you have to figure out what other changes are going to result from it, what the ramifications are. And so many science fiction novels are ruined by the fact that the writers don't think what the ramifications are going to be. I mean, if you just look at Star Wars for a second, it's not a problem in Star Wars because we're dealing with a galaxy far away and a long time ago, but think about what it takes to power a lightsaber. The incredible amount of battery power it takes to run a lightsaber. It's pretty well implemented in Star Wars, but what if we were to have that kind of battery here and now today as a sudden introduction? The entire world economy would change. It may not change at a vast level, but would change as a ripple effect throughout the economy because every electronic device could be powered for hours, days, years in the case of some, forever in the case of some of them. It would change the way electronics are made. And so you as a writer, if you were to introduce that kind of change, would have to follow the logic through as many steps as you could to make the implementation of this change a realistic one. Because if you don't, your reader's going to say, this don't make sense. You know, I'll read something else instead. Every one of you has a wall that is directly across where you do most of your reading that is dimpled with book spots, at least metaphorically, from fiction that you've read that is like this, that is not completely thought out. So you think out your magic systems, think out your scientific systems, think out all the changes you introduce, think out your species. I mean, if you introduce an apex predator into a closed environment without a creature that is its enemy and hunts it, what happens? It takes over. If you don't have a book where that is taken over, you've made a mistake. So, think about the ramifications. Think about your science and your magic. Scene purpose. This is something I get into real heavily in that book on plotting I was telling you about. Every scene in your book should have multiple purposes. You know, a purpose can be something like introducing character details, pointing to the future, foreshadowing, or advancing character goals. You need to be able to look at every discrete scene in your book as you're going through on one of your passages and say, what is this scene for? And if your answer is, I don't know, then you have a problem. If there's an I don't know, it means you not only don't have a purpose, you don't have several purposes, you need to have several purposes for each scene. One of the virtues of having multiple purposes, if you have multiples, then you can disguise some of the purposes with other purposes, which is a nice tricky thing that writers like to do, and writers like to do to you. So think about doing it back to them. But every scene, a purpose, multiple purposes, and that should be something you test for in one of your passes through the book. Then you get into more ordinary stuff, more mundane stuff. Spelling and punctuation. Do a pass for spelling and punctuation. That will give your creative brain a rest from all the other stuff, all the more weighty stuff you've been doing as you've been going through over and over again. But spelling and punctuation, if you're going to be dealing with a professional editor, they're going to notice if it isn't very good, so make it good. Character voice. Now, this is something that is not necessarily easy to get when you're doing your initial write of a novel. I mean, if you're writing straight through at rip-roaring speed, as this technique kind of recommends, you can get to the end and discover that most of your characters speak with kind of the same voice, kind of the same inflection, kind of the same personal vocabulary. But think about it, if your characters are Mickey, Goofy, and Donald, they shouldn't have the same voice. I use those examples because this is Orlando, people. But think about it, Mickey, Goofy, and Donald do not speak the same even remotely.
Aaron, you've got a question.
Question?
If I may offer a suggestion, Michael Stackpole actually brought this very issue up a few years back at Silicon, and he suggested that you work on character voice by writing pure dialogue and seeing if at the end of the day you can tell who is speaking without any narrative help.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Mike uses that advice in a series of seminars he and I do at DragonCon and Origins every year. So if any of you are going to DragonCon, you might think about looking up Mike's seminars on that issue while you're there. But yes, this is one of the virtues of doing a writing pass where you're just doing dialogue, especially if you do it first. You can look through it and go, yeah, this sounds kind of blended together. So yes, if you can tell just at a glance who is speaking, then you're probably starting to do a pretty good job with dialogue. If you can't, you need to work on it some more. But yes, thank you for that reminder. Character voice. Okay. Now, once you've gotten through all these steps, you're done. No, you're not. But you are done with a whole sequence of passes, your major analytical passes. The good news is you've got a more polished novel. The bad news?
Still crap.
Bingo. But it's much less crappier than it was. Much less crappier than it was. I must use proper grammar even when saying crappy. So, your next series of passes are intended to develop flavors and style. I'm borrowing the term developing flavors from the art of cooking, which I don't do, but I can still borrow the term. Most of you who are cooks know that when you cook something slowly, across a span of hours, the flavors develop. They become richer, they interrelate and interact better. Imagine a New Orleans gumbo cooked in 30 minutes. And try to taste that in your mouth and go, that's not developed flavors. You want your novel to have the characteristic of developed flavors in your writing ability and your writing style. And so we're going to talk about ways to polish and improve toward the style you want to be writing in. And this is the stage at which you do it. Except we're not quite there yet. The first thing you want to do at this stage is set your novel aside. Just set it aside. If you're doing NaNoWriMo, you're thinking, well, I can't set it aside for more than 6 minutes. But the fact is, if you're doing NaNoWriMo, the stage you're at now is sufficient to submit for, validation for NaNoWriMo. You have a complete novel with all the elements addressed. You want to set this book aside for, I would recommend 6 weeks. If you haven't done it before. If you have and know that your own sort of baking time is shorter or longer, set it aside for that amount of time. But for your first couple of times, try 6 weeks where you set it aside and you don't do anything with it. Except maybe send it out to some advanced readers and say, please give me your comments in 6 weeks, and if you get them to me before, thank you, but I'm not going to look at them until 6 weeks are done. Because this guy in Orlando told me not to touch the manuscript.
Isn't it kind of like the Ray Bradbury philosophy?
Which specific one?
Putting it aside, Ray Bradbury would write something start to finish and then set it aside and walk away from it and then come back to it.
Yes, it will allow you to, what the 6 weeks or whatever amount of time you take will allow you to do is come back to it with a more critical, distant, objective eye. Some of what I write is done with pretty tight deadline pressure, and I'm not able to do this. I have to rely on my instincts and the perspective of advanced readers and editors because of very tight deadline constraints. And what this does to you as a writer is it gives you a massive feeling of insecurity because you are too close to the material to have a sense of whether it's any good. And that's not a good feeling to have. You can have, 20 some odd novels under your belt and it will still be the same. And I know because I do. It's not a good feeling to not know whether what you've written is any good. So if you have the opportunity to set it aside for a few weeks, by all means, take it. It'll make you feel better if it does nothing else. It'll make you feel better when you come back to it because you will have a much more objective sense of what you have accomplished in your first several passes on this novel.
Aaron, you've got a question.
Question?
What do you do if you put it aside for 6 years and you're not even sure if it's worth picking back up again?
Well, the first thing to do is to reread it all the way through because that will give you a sense of whether it's worth picking up again. Sometimes it's not even an issue of whether it's worth picking up again. I've done some partial drafts of things, set them aside for years, come back to them and say, this was pretty cool, but I'm not the same guy anymore. I can't write this, which is a little sad. You have to kind of cannibalize it. You do some organ harvesting for pieces you might be able to use. But since you're not the same person, you can't really write what you had in mind originally. But really, when you set it aside for all those years, you don't look at it at the closed manuscript box and say, I wonder if it's something I can still work with. You have to reread it, top to bottom, and then decide for yourself.
You've got another
It seems
question.
very daunting to pick it to even, I've got it sitting and it seems so daunting to even reread it again.
I'm sorry, can you speak louder, please?
It seems daunting to even pick it back up and reread it and dig back into it again.
Well, when we're talking about daunting, might I point out that I just told you to write and rewrite your own novel about 17 times so far. Everything you do, all put together to complete a novel, is a tremendous amount of work. What I'm talking about with this method, with this technique, is a tremendous amount of work. The thing you have to understand is that it is not more work than doing the novel the traditional way. It's just if you're familiar with the traditional way, you may not be aware of the amount of work you're doing. And what you're talking about, the daunting nature of digging into a novel that is several years old and you haven't seen or thought about in all that time, yes, it's a tremendous amount of work. But it is no more work than you will have been doing on any novel you've written from the start to finish and polished into a decent amount of shape. It's all pretty much the same amount of work. So it's a matter of gritting your teeth and jumping in and hoping for the best.
And you've got another question.
Fire away.
You spoke about explaining your science and your magic. Like when you're writing with Star Wars, a lot of that stuff has been laid out for you previously. I mean, as far as like technology and things like that, of course. But when you're writing in other areas, what are the best methods that you like to do to research?
I got. What do you, when you're writing in other areas? What are and then your voice went a little faint. Can you speak up?
Oh, sorry. Like when you're trying to explain like your science and your magic. I mean, are there methods that you like to use for, like, say, trying to describe stuff that has not been touched upon in other realms?
You're speaking specifically in Star Wars or in anything in general?
In general, really.
Well, a lot of times when you are elaborating on a change in an environment that is the basic nature of science fiction, you really do have to cast it in terms of things that are somewhat familiar, so that there will be a reader identification and connection with what you're doing. The example that I like to use is the Alien movie series, starting with Alien in 1979, and then Aliens, Alien 3, et cetera, et cetera. The Alien is a pretty creepy thing visually, but if you know something about the life on your own world, you realize that the alien is a termite wasp. There's a type of wasp that will grab a termite, it will sting it in its brainstem, which makes it its voluntary activities go away, although it still can walk around and be dragged around. It'll drag that termite into a nest, seal it up, plant eggs in it, and wander off, and those eggs hatch out of it. a lot of the other behaviors that are invested in the Giger alien are from a wasp. And so we see it and we say, oh, that's alien and creepy and horrible, but actually we're familiar with some of the behaviors because they belong to the insect life of our own world. So when you are, the thing to do when you are elaborating on any change is first to think about how characters experiencing it will experience it, because if you can see that, you can describe it to others. And then think in terms of what it is even remotely, approximately like, so that the if you think in those terms, the readers will have a greater sense of connection with it, even if it is a pretty far-reaching or significant change. So the thing to do always is to keep it personal. You're writing novels through the eyes of characters, and so you have to be able to write what they are seeing and do it in such a way that the readers understand what they are seeing. That's your big task. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
And you've got another question.
Fire away.
Aaron, for those of us that have actually been in that,
Please speak up, please.
for those of us that have actually been in that flow state that you described, whenever you come out of it and you start going back and rereading your stuff, the biggest problem that I've had so far is trying to figure out how to avoid one long chapter that's 375 pages. How exactly, I mean, you've written a fair number of books. How do you avoid that pitfall?
Well, I tell you, the question is, how if you're writing a lot in flow state writing, do you avoid writing a book that is all one chapter? Or maybe all one paragraph. And you're writing on a word processor, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Look, the answer to this is ridiculously simple. And you're probably going to hate me for giving you this answer. I have written novels that were all one chapter, although I haven't quite written one all one paragraph. You can go through a long, blocky piece of text and insert chapter breaks. You have to know what a chapter is, what it's for. The first thing to do is go through and see where your scene breaks are. I mean, a scene is a kind of discrete block of text with a kind of distinct beginning and distinct end, a more or less contiguous set of places, a more or less contiguous sense of time, a more or less constant set of characters. When you get to the point in the events where in a movie you'd fade to black or cut to another location, you're at the end of the scene. You put 3 empty lines in between, or an empty line and then 3 asterisks, or whatever it is you use to indicate a scene break, and then go on to the next scene. And then once your book is parsed into scenes, you can go through and decide, well, how long in general do I want my chapters to be? If you think in pages, X number of pages, call it 10, 12 pages. If you think in words, think in terms of 2,000, 2,500, maybe 3,000 words at most. And you go through and you find the breakpoints that are closest to those word length or page lengths. And you insert chapter breaks there. And you can fiddle around with it more than that, because you can break in the middle of a scene if to do so is to introduce an element of high tension as there's a sudden revelation or someone is suddenly plunged into greater danger, and you think that your readers will curse you if they actually have to skip a page to come back to the situation. You can put in chapter breaks when you want your readers to realize that there is a transition going on, and that will give them a chance to reflect on what has just happened, because readers need to reflect too, as part of what we refer to as crest and trough pacing. So you do all this, you can introduce your entire chapter structure when you're completely done, and I've done this in a couple of novels. So if your natural inclination is to write through in one big regurgitated block, do that. Did that answer your question? Also, buy my book on plotting. It talks a lot about chapter breaks. Okay, when I said that I was just going to do one self-promotion, I lied.
And we've got 2 more questions. Got you up here and down here. 2 more questioners,
Fire away.
Aaron.
You mentioned about the different elements of writing on one stream and another stream and another stream. If you've already written a book, say halfway through, how do you switch up to going to where you're doing the passes and then going back and editing the whole thing?
Well, that's pretty simple. I mean, I don't know that necessarily that's the way you want to do it, but if you do, you know, you put a demarcation line at the point you are in your manuscript. It could be an entire page of asterisk or something that says, you know, do not go back before this point. And you start writing forward from that point when using the technique I'm talking about. And you know, when you come back to the start is actually the start of that demarcation line. So when you get to the end of the process of writing this way, you probably want to get to the end of the analytical pass, but not the flavor and style pass. When you get to the flavor and style passes I'm about to talk about, you can then actually go back to the very start of the novel's original start point and move forward from there. But for these steps, for the creative passes and for the analytical passes, you just go back to the part where you started over, where you started this new technique. And it shouldn't be that difficult for you. You will find, when you actually bring those two halves of the book together, that it's a rough transition. You're probably going to have to write a lot more bridge material at that point to make things smooth out. But that's not a big task. It's just a matter of you know, realizing what you've done before, what you've done after, and what you need to do to bridge those gaps. But yeah, you can start at any point and just come back to that one point until you're done with the analytical passes.
And Aaron, you had another questioner.
You mentioned the function of a chapter. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? If there's any other purpose for chapters than creating cliffhangers and giving readers a chance to.
There are a lot.
read?
The problem with elaborating at this point is that I have a list of, I don't know, 50, 60 different functions for chapters, this panel, I've got 22 minutes to conclude it, and that's not enough time even to scratch the surface of those. If you're coming to DragonCon or Origins, I do a panel. If you're interested in that's part of the plotting book I've done. And you can catch me outside this panel, and I'll talk about that to a certain extent. But it is huge. It is a huge list of options for you. And so right now is not the time to talk about it.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Style passes. I did it again.
And 20-minute warning.
Yes. That's why I said 22 minutes. Just a minute.
You know, I'm too busy looking for answers.
You never listen to me. It's okay. Let's see. Where was I? That was a lot of questions. I've gotten lost.
You left off with set your novel aside.
Yes. And I just came to the word aside. All right, 6 weeks. Yes, start at 6 weeks. All right. One of the things to do in these style passes is look at paragraph structure and length. This thing is very mechanical, and it is. But you want to make sure that your paragraph structure, your paragraph length especially, are appropriate for the section of the book you're writing. If you are writing an action-packed chapter, you want short chapters. If you're writing a more reflective chapter, you can go longer. Sentence structure is the same way. And by the way, one of the things that since you've been to some of Mike Stackpole's panels, he will tell you is that you don't want to have sentences that are simple, straightforward sentences more than 12 words long. If you're going to have more than 12 words long, you want to have a punctuation in there that breaks it into discrete thoughts of no more than 12 words, because we as humans tend to parse thoughts that are only up to about 12 words long. And then we condense them, shove them aside, and go on to the next one. So if you have a sentence that's 37 words long with no comma, and you have a bunch of them, what you're going to do is wear out your reader. They may understand exactly what you're talking about, but the effort to parse sentences that long is actually tiring. And so if you write academically, then you are actually not doing your readers a service. You need to have shorter sentence structure. Paragraphs, like I say, short for action, long for reflective, in the middle for tense, dialogue or conflict, that sort of thing that is not action-packed. But structure your paragraphs according to where you are in the story. And I should have done that here because this is a really long paragraph. Directional modifiers. This is something that has to do with just a very finicky little style issue. Joe walked to the rear of the car and opened up the trunk. Everybody understand that sentence? Nobody understood this sentence? Okay.
Yep,
Yes.
Commander.
Joe walked to the back of the car and opened up the trunk. There is an unnecessary word there. Actually, a couple of them. Up. Why open up a trunk when you can open a trunk? If you open a trunk, it's identical in meaning, in semantic meaning, to opening up a trunk. Therefore, the word up is styrofoam packing peanuts, what it is. And you don't need it. And the thing is, a lot of readers will not notice it. A lot of editors will, some readers will. Some people will get the sense that you're right with a little amount of fatty tissue in your text. There's a sports announcer, Troy Aikman. Many of you remember him as a quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. He does sports announcing now, and he'll say things like his career went longer than what mine did. I want to strangle him, but if I tried, he'd crush me to a fine powder. But
Don't worry,
that
he's gravy
what
trained.
is an extraneous word. It's not needed. And the thing about extra words in your prose is they weaken your prose. And if you're doing it here, you're doing it elsewhere as well. And I'll talk about some of the places you might be doing it. But anytime you can cut out these little extra words, your prose becomes tighter and a little bit more dynamic and a little bit stronger, and it acts on the subconscious of the people reading it. They will like it a little better because you get there fast and efficiently and powerfully, as opposed to taking your dawdling time and meandering to your goal. So,
Aaron?
yes.
You've got another question.
Question.
If I may present an example of what you're talking about, that it can kind of go in a process. You say you can move up, so this could be walked toward. Oh wait,
Well,
wait.
the thing to do is to ask yourself, is this word required in this sentence? If you say, Mary walked toward the distant lights, well, what's the sentence without it? Mary walked to distant lights. That makes no sense. So that sentence requires toward. Joe walked up the stairs. Well, we do need the up or the down because you can pretty much go either direction on stairs. But you don't need Fred opened up the trunk, because Fred opened the trunk makes perfect sense without the up. So examine the sentence without the word and you'll know whether you need it. And that's a piece of advice for anything. Examine the sentence without the word you're wondering.
Do that a lot in screenwriting.
What's that?
I do that a lot in screenwriting.
Yes.
I do a lot of passive voice.
Screenwriting requires very, very tight
Active
prose.
voice, man.
Yeah. Active prose is another one. Active versus passive prose. Passive voice is when you say things like, the ball was hit by the bat. The subject of the sentence is actually being acted upon by the predicate. And that is weaker writing. If you say instead, the bat connected to the ball went flying as if shot out of a cannon, that's more powerful, that has more strength than the ball was hit by the bat. So now that's passive voice. Active voice is what you want to go for. So on one of your passages, you look for active voice. You will want to look for all forms of the verb to be. It's not that you will be eliminating them all, but you should in fact evaluate every one of them. Mary was happy. Okay, it could be exactly correct that Mary was happy. But I will tell you this right now. A sentence like that, which makes such a fundamental use of the word to be, if you restructure it to show why or how Mary is expressing the fact that she is happy, that passage will be more powerful. It will be stronger, your readers will like it better, your editors will like it better. And you will look a little less like a novice. Adjectives and adverbs. You don't want to get rid of all of them by any means. Some of them are necessary. But in one of your passages, you should actually look discreetly at every one of your adjectives and every one of your adverbs and say, is this necessary? If you wanted to suggest that a character is walking briskly down the sidewalk, well, briskly, people more or less know what it means, but it is still kind of an insulator between what you're describing and what you want them to experience. If you can find a better way to describe the character's brisk gait, what it reminds the reader of. Is it like a young goat, trotting down the street, or is it suggestive of the fact that he must have had too much sugar and caffeine in his breakfast this morning? That tells the reader more. That gives the reader more information, more of a connection with the character than saying briskly. Now watch out for shocking. TV anchormen love to use the word shocking. And what this means is, we're going to tell you a story and you will be shocked. Because you are really dull, unimaginative people, and you will be shocked. And these stories are generally not shocking to anybody who was born after about 1870. But they want you to think you're going to be shocked. Well, you're not. So be careful when you want to say something is shocking, because it isn't. Unless you have readers born before 1870. Okay, we're in the final 10 minutes of what we're talking about. I could go on about these final stylistic passages, but I think you get the gist of what I'm talking about. Anything you have seen in other writers' work that is a stylistic affectation or mistake you do not like, you add it to your list of what you're going to go through and do passes through your novel on, and ask yourself, am I doing the same thing? And if you are, look at every iteration and say, do I need to keep this? Can I lose it? Can I rewrite it to make it stronger? Can I rewrite it to make it better? And when you get through with this, when you get through with all these passes, you're done. And I'm not kidding this time. You're done. And so, start your next novel. And that gives us about 10 minutes for any final questions that we might have from the audience. So fire up your engines.
All right, green shirt question.
You mentioned about, or you touched briefly on punctuation. One of the biggest problems that I've had so far is trying to avoid being particularly comma happy, but not commas so badly as semicolons.
Yes, that's actually a little later in the notes I didn't quite get to, but semicolons are a bad idea. The reason semicolons are a bad idea is because they usually take the place of periods. You will strengthen your work if you go through your manuscript and you look at every semicolon. You will want to keep some of them. But if you look at every semicolon and where possible, break that into 2 sentences. And I can assure you, when I say you will keep some of them, I mean you will keep about 10%. Semicolons are a bad replacement for periods. They make especially now. I'm going to level this as a criticism of Star Wars fans. Well, actually, it's not. But some fans read the fiction so fast that they miss a lot of details, and a semicolon is a real easy place to miss a detail. Because you blast through what amounts to 2 sentences worth of material and think that it's one, and meaning can become garbled if you are reading that fast. So for the sake of your readers, especially the ones who will read Mercy Kill in 4 hours, try to break things up into discrete sentences as often as possible. And if this means doing a search, an actual word processor search for every semicolon, do it.
Aaron, you've got 3 more questioners lined up.
Fire away.
Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Actually, he just asked mine, so I'll take this opportunity to congratulate you on Mercy Kill making the New York Times bestseller list.
Thank you. I was worried about that.
Okay, Trooper.
Do you have, the best way to describe it would be a white whale of a story, one that it's in your head, you just keep going back to, but you just can't get right, and if you do or have, how do you solve that issue?
Okay, I'm going to disappoint you here because I don't. The thing about elements like that is that generally they yield to sufficient analysis, either sufficient analysis on your part, or the fact that you may not be the person to write that story when you first conceive of it, and only growing maturity as a human being and as a writer will allow you to do it, a few years later. I recommend you go in for the learning the analytical side of the craft, and seeing if that does the job, and if not, then just keep plugging at it. Return to it every couple of years and see if at some point you are the guy to do it. Once again, I will plug plotting, because there are some tools in there that actually do help you do what I refer to as cracking a story, which is trying to figure out what it is in the story that is refusing to tell you how it's supposed to be told. There are some things you can do to improve your chances to crack it. But anyway, it's analysis and maturity and hoping for the best.
All right, and our second trooper.
When you talk about character development and you go through and you see you develop how great this character is, what do you get to the point where you realize in order to better the story, you have to kill the character off, but you don't want to, but it actually helps flesh out the story more.
So how do you bring yourself to do it?
Yeah.
That is also an issue of maturity, but it largely boils down to asking yourself, am I a role player today or am I a writer? The writer has to be able to do the hard things to make the story be meaningful. Tell me, I want a show of hands that I won't be able to see. How many of you think that you would know the story of Romeo and Juliet if they had lived happily ever after? It's not many of you.
No, in fact, it is not.
Romeo and Juliet is only powerful because it is a tragedy, because you feel something for these two stupid kids. And you, as a writer, must look at your book and say, do I want this to be meaningful or do I want it to be facile?
Okay.
And keep asking yourself until you're able to answer.
We have another question over here.
Aaron, I was a big fan of the Rogue series growing up. Great book. So I just had it's a two-part question real quick. One, what was your favorite book to write out of that series? And two, was Race Squadron your idea to kind of bring on and add to the series, or did you?
The favorite of the original X-Wings I wrote was Starfighters of Agumar. And the reason for that was it was a real relief. I mean, I was plunged a little early because of a long story I can't tell today, but I was plunged long after I should have been into writing Race Squadron. I had to catch up for problems that were not my doing. It was a very tense effort to write that one, and then the other two were playing catch up. By the time Starfighters of Agumar came around, I was under no pressure from any publisher. They said, we need a book to round out the damn contract. Do whatever you want. And there was really no expectations about it, and it was just really easy to write. As for Race Squadron, the squadron itself was my idea. Basically, when I got the book assignment for the X-Wing, I was months behind because nobody had told me I'd gotten it. Like, it's a long story. I was months behind, so I called Michael Stackpole in a panic and said, "Well, I'm doing these. What do I do?" And he said, "It's simple. First, we got a warlord named Zin. He needs taken care of before Courtship of Princess Leia. Second, all you need to do is create a new squadron, give them a cool name, and try to make it funny. The fans like that." So it's all Mike's fault.
Questioner in the white shirt, and then the Master Jedi.
Is there a particular word processor or software stack that is best suited for this style of writing?
No. There is no word processor that is specifically best suited. The thing is, what is best suited is the one that you are most comfortable with. Pretty much anything will be able to generate a WordPerfect doc format, which is what you'll need to submit to various publishers or RTF. The question is, does it work with your internal mental logic? My internal mental logic works best with WordPerfect. And I do not say this because I want you all to go out and buy WordPerfect. Many of you think it's no longer being produced. But because it is what works for me. For you, it may be Microsoft Word, it may be LibreOffice or OpenOffice, it may be AbiWord, it may be a text editor, it may be a number of things. It may be WordPad, which comes free with Windows. What works best for you? Because it needs to be transparent. You need not to be futzing with word processor controls, you need to be writing. And so whatever is most transparent to you is the absolute best word processor for you.
Master Jedi?
If you have two separate storylines in the same book that converge later, would you suggest doing them separately until they converge, or doing them at the same time using your,
I would suggest you write chronologically. You write to point A in the story with your group A and then with group B and so forth and so on. Because as you do so, you will find more ways for the two circumstances to interrelate. Even if the characters are dimensions apart, something that one group does can actually cause ripples and ramifications that the others notice. And you get the best sense of that if you're writing concurrently. But you can still make it work if your particular stylist writes consecutively. It's just, I don't think, quite as natural to most people. If it's more natural to you, I suspect you're an engineer. But if it works for you, great.
And you have another question over here.
I was with various forms of written text, such as italics, bold, and underline. I was wondering what your feelings on using those were. Are they more of a crutch, or should you try to use words to imply the meaning that the italics or the bold or the underline would have?
With fiction, you almost never need bold. I mean, if you're setting off some words because they're a sign somebody is reading, or a chapter head, or one of those little blurbs at the top of the chapter that tells you that you're in Afghanistan, 1984. You can use bold, and that's no problem. But you don't generally need it in your prose. As for italics, that's one of the things you want to do in your style pass. You want to look at every word that you have italicized. Some of them you will want to keep, especially if, for example, you're a kind of traditionalist who likes to italicize words that are out of foreign languages. But if you're using italics, where you're using italics for stress, the question is, do you need it? And what you do is you eliminate the italics and read that sentence to yourself out loud. And then you put the italics back in and read it out loud and ask yourself, well, is it the same sentence? Am I reading it the same way? Is the natural inclination when you're reading the sentence without italics to stress the same word? And if it is, you get rid of the italics because it's unnecessary. Get rid of anything that is unnecessary.
Aaron, it's 3:29 and you've got another question.
And this will be the last question. Where is the question?
If you want a character to think to him or herself, in other words, not exchanging dialogue, but he or she is having a conversation with his own subconscious, and you want your reader to know that. I've seen it used where it is in italics. That's what reminded me of this question. But I sometimes fall into the trap of I have them thinking to themselves for 4 pages long. What do you recommend to condense that?
Okay, the first thing is I'll address a side issue for a second. You want it to be italicized when you are quoting verbatim what his thoughts are, when he is actually thinking those exact words. If he is thinking in more general terms, you want to use non-italicized text. If you are doing 4 pages of reflection, then you want to make sure it's not all italicized, because that would be an incredibly long monologue if it were being spoken out loud. But what you want to do when a character has to do that much thinking is you interweave the internal monologue with other things. For example, if he does his thinking while driving home, you will have him thinking about what he needs to be doing and then occasionally taking note of landmarks or making realizations about what he needs to do, or noticing something strange in the neighborhood that is relevant to later on in the plot, so that you are able to skip in and out of his head in such a way that the reader's interest is maintained if he is not that heavily invested in the thinking processes. You intertwine characterization with action, with exposition, with internal monologue, and the more skillfully you do it, the more like a really tasty salad you give the reader, as opposed to something that is all one big block of tofu. And I'm afraid that's the last question I can answer in the time available. I'll be outside for a few minutes to hand out cards about the plotting book for anyone who's interested, and I'll be doing a signing at 6 o'clock at the Barnes & Noble.